Whether it's concert tickets, airfares, hotels or ride shares.
Uber has increased the price times 6, so there's no way that I'm going to actually book it.
We've all been subject to surge pricing, pressure selling and subscription traps. It's just a part of life.
They're pretty widespread and they've become commonplace, so consumers, I think, don't necessarily even see them as something that's out of the ordinary anymore.
Well, the Aussies don't think so, and they're planning to ban these tricky pricing practices. So what's New Zealand doing? Welcome to the NBR Podcast. I'm your host, Simon Shepherd. Dynamic pricing, drip pricing, subscription traps, time-limited selling. If you've bought or signed up to anything online, it's highly likely you've experienced some or all of these. But just to be clear about what they are, I've brought in a marketing expert.
The supply and demand is kind of the driving force behind it. So if the demand is exceeding the supply, either the supply has to go up or you have to manage the demand in some way.
Dr. Jessica Vredenberg is a senior marketing lecturer at AUT. So dynamic pricing, let's start there. So this is the practice of, in the past, it was like, if there's big demand, the price changes. If there wasn't big demand, the price goes down. But it happens now whilst you're actually in the process of a transaction or looking around.
Right.
That's dynamic pricing, is it?
So dynamic pricing essentially is altering the price based on some sort of external factor. So whether that's the demand itself, the supply, maybe the supply has dropped, seasonality. We see the cost of fans go up when summer hits. But where the questions are coming in now is the change to being based much more tightly on consumers' individual data as opposed to the more known, travel periods and things like that, as well as the changes within.
So rather than the broad trends,
yes,
the individual data could determine what kind of price you're going to be offered.
Absolutely,
yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
All right, so that's dynamic pricing. Let's just briefly go through a couple of the others.
Yeah.
Subscription traps, pretty simple.
Making it hard to get out of, once you're sort of locked in, making it not clear or the barriers to exit are increased.
Increased, all right.
Yeah.
Drip pricing?
That's really where extra costs are added sort of after the fact, whether that's a service fee or some sort of maintenance charge or something else that isn't necessarily stated up front in the quoted price.
And another one which we get when we're trying to buy a concert ticket, this sense of pressure or scarcity or deadline while you're doing a transaction. So what's happening there? Yeah,
so the concert is a little bit in the dynamic space, but also, of course, you have the urgency of being in a queue, and then when you get to the front of the queue, the clock counting down for the amount of time that you have to decide whether you're going to make that purchase or not. So that echoes a little bit of, some of our traditional sales tactics where that sense of urgency is created because there's a fear of missing out. There's a fear that there's not enough to go around. It sort of activates our innate competitive nature to sort of, protect and get whatever is available for ourselves.
It's FOMO, right?
Basically, FOMO. And when we're activated in that way, we can't sort of think as rationally, and we feel like we've lost a bit of control over the decision-making process, which I think is one of the concerns with what's happening now, is that uncertainty, that feeling of a loss of control over making a decision in a buying process because of the urgency, because of the perceived scarcity.
Dynamic pricing in particular has been in the spotlight this year. When Oasis reunion tickets went on sale, prices surged while people waited in the queue. In America, it was a burger chain that ended up in the headlines.
Good morning to you, George. Yeah, it is Uber surge pricing at the drive-thru window, and we've heard...
That story was sparked by this comment to investors from the Wendy's CEO.
Beginning as early as 2025, we will begin testing more enhanced features like dynamic pricing and day-part offerings, along with AI-enabled menu changes and suggestive selling.
Wendy's America had to clarify that was not the same as surge pricing. And we should make clear Wendy's New Zealand told the NBR Podcast it was not considering dynamic pricing. But surge pricing is here. Previously on the podcast, Air New Zealand's CEO Greg Foran was unapologetic.
If you book very late, that tends to be what happens. If you book ahead of time, you can get very reasonable fares.
We also reached out to Ticketmaster to ask about its in-demand tickets category, but no response as yet. But one industry that was willing to front up was the accommodation sector. Adam Cunningham is the Managing Director of Motive, a business group that owns and looks after small and large hotels and motels. So lots of rooms to sell.
Lots and lots. Thousands.
Thousands. Well, if anybody knows, hopefully you do. So what is dynamic pricing?
Look, dynamic pricing is the pricing of your room on any particular night movement based on a range of factors, whether that be occupancy of your own product or your own property, occupancy of the region, occupancy of the comp set, your competitor set.
Adam Cunningham says there are two types of dynamic pricing. There's the complex algorithms of the booking sites like
Trivago, Booking.com,
at whatif.com.
Sites that scrape prices and then try and entice customers with deals.
Then there's basic dynamic pricing, which is actually surge pricing.
Right.
And that's literally the property having the lowest price it'll sell for, the highest price it'll sell for. There's probably a couple of prices in between. And as occupancy changes, both for them and their comp set, then they will either manually or with their third-party supplier move to the next tier within that range.
Okay. So is it sort of predetermined that there is this potential range of what a property will sell for on a particular night, given what's happening in the region, whether it's a concert or a whatever, and then it's just going to adjust up to what they think is the maximum depending on that demand?
Yes, although we hear a lot, especially when the media get excited about some property has sold a room that normally goes for $300 for $4,000. That's rate gouging, and we wouldn't partake in that.
Let's talk Coldplay, right?
We'll go with Coldplay. Yeah, good call. Long before they announce they're coming, the property knows what its maximum price is for each of its rooms. Where you see rate gouging is when people don't have that management of their rates between lowest and highest, and they just pick a number. They're cowboys. There's very few of them in the industry, and there's very few of them that last in the industry for very long.
As a quick test, we looked online at whatif.com to compare prices in Auckland for Wednesday, the 6th of November, and for the following Wednesday, the night of the first Coldplay concert. Here's 3 examples. The Movenpick Superior King Room, $404, goes up to $666. Sky City Grand Deluxe King, $521, up to $913. And a suite at the Voco went from $1,000 to $1,400.
Well, ultimately, hotels use dynamic pricing to maximise return on the asset. And unless investors can get a reasonable return on their equity, people won't invest in building hotels.
James Doolan represents the Hotel Council Aotearoa.
With the huge investment that goes into hotels and looking at a typical Auckland hotel, that investment per room, kind of a single one-bedroom apartment, that investment per room might be kind of $500,000 for a very simple lower-end property per room, right up to more than $1 million for a high-end experience. And on top of that, you provide service and cleaning and all that. So you've got to maximise returns. If your rate's too high, but you haven't sold enough rooms out, that's inefficient. If your rate's too low and you've sold all the hotel out, then you're not maximising returns either.
So you're trying to find the sweet spot all the time.
Constantly.
And the algorithms are basically juggling all this data about how many people are looking at your site, what the competition's doing, what events are going on.
Yeah, and then it gets, and this complexity is really important to understand. The way many people listening to your podcast think about surge pricing is they think about what's called the price available to an FIT, a free independent traveller.
Yeah.
Right? So what they're thinking about is, Coldplay's on next week, next month, or 2 months away, depending on how organised the customer is. And they're thinking, I go into either the hotel website or I go onto booking.com and the price has gone up from what I was expecting, right? That's an FIT. But the typical hotel doesn't sell all 200 rooms to FITs, to free independent travellers.
Right.
That same hotel, that large Auckland hotel, might have sold 50% of its rooms to wholesalers.
Let's take Coldplay as an example. So I went on What If, and for this Wednesday, and this podcast comes out on Thursday, but so on Wednesday, so Sky City Grand 473, but for the same Wednesday when Coldplay's in town, it's 913. And that's just
correct.
one example, right? So it's about, it's twice. And there's other examples like that as well.
Yeah.
Why is that?
So that room is now serving a particular customer, right? The particular customer is the person who's so price indifferent they didn't have to arrange their accommodation for Coldplay until the last minute. I mean, that is who the hotel is serving with those final rates.
Right.
So
are they serving them, or are they just trying to get the last bit of, profitability out of that event?
Well, again, this is this classic theory of segmenting the market, and you have folks who are price sensitive can get organised earlier and go for other tiers of accommodation rather than a very nice, 5-star hotel in Auckland. And I think it comes back to a really key point to understand about the accommodation sector is all of these pricing decisions in the hotel sector are made by numerous competing hoteliers, moteliers, and there are plenty of other alternatives than staying in any one particular hotel.
Okay. So you think that, the market will govern how much hoteliers can charge when there's a big event in place, right? It's not just plain old surge pricing.
Well, for a starting point, the Commerce Act governs it to some extent. Hoteliers can't sit together in a room and say, hey, team, let's get together and
that's why it's the market doing it.
And so correct. And so that the hotels have to make a decision when they're offering final rates at $950 that may be for 3 or 4 rooms. They do have to make a decision whether they're providing value for money. The chances that final customer or final guest will feel like they've overpaid might damage them returning. But New Zealanders, I think, need to slightly get away from this idea of the hotel is just an alternative bed for me to sleep in at the absolute cheapest price because I need to be in Auckland rather than at my home elsewhere.
Cheapskates.
Well, no, I'm not. I'm not calling Kiwis cheapskates, but I will say this: the average daily rate across all of Auckland last month was 200 New Zealand dollars, and so. I do say to New Zealanders, and this is true, New Zealand is not remotely an expensive hotel market for the quality of product you get, like in a city like Auckland.
Good value or not, it's how things are being sold online that has upset the Aussies. Here's Assistant Treasurer Stephen Jones.
Look, a lot of these ticket sellers and others have engaged in what can only be described as sharp and tricky practice. It's emerged over time.
The NBR podcast went to our relevant minister, Andrew Bailey, no answer as yet, and also to the Minister of Business, Innovation and Employment, which said,
no work is currently underway to address unfair trading practices. However, MBIE monitors international developments, including those in Australia, to consider whether similar changes could be explored.
What is wrong with those practices? Here's John Duffy from Consumer NZ.
Well, none of them are kind of per se illegal in New Zealand at the moment, but first and foremost, they're manipulative, right? So they are designed to either deceive, trick, or manipulate consumers into making a decision they otherwise wouldn't have made. So, particularly in a digital trading environment where there's already an imbalance of power between the website host, the trader, and the consumer, these tactics stack the odds even more in favour of the business designing the website.
I guess the business is trying to maximise revenue. Is that bad?
No, not per se, but it is bad when tactics are used to manipulate consumers. And those tactics are often very difficult for a consumer to detect and combat. So, a good example is scarcity marketing. So when a website says, deal available for the next 3 minutes, and there's a clock counting down, that deal's probably available after those 3 minutes. That tactic is really just there to produce pressure on the purchaser to hurry their decision and not think through it as carefully as they could.
How widespread are these practices?
They're pretty widespread, and they've become commonplace. So consumers, I think, don't necessarily even see them as something that's out of the ordinary anymore.
One of the most annoying, having talked to colleagues and other friends, is when the price changes while you are either in a queue or looking around a booking site. This is so-called dynamic pricing, I guess. There's no way to avoid that, but people can't understand why it's changing so much.
Yeah, I think again, this is not illegal, right? So our Fair Trading Act is predicated, well, the sections relating to misleading price representations is predicated on the premise that there's an agreed price for those goods. And in a modern digital environment, actually it's not like you're walking into a shop and you're looking at a price tag. Pricing can be individualized to you as that particular shopper on that particular day, using all the data that the seller already knows about you, I don't know, based on your previous purchasing history with them or whatever. So it's not misleading for me to say the price for Simon is $100 and the price for John is $150. That's just the way it is. Whereas if, in a traditional shop, someone said, well, the price is $100, and then they tried to charge you $150, that would be a breach of the Fair Trading Act.
So is there room there for sort of upfront disclosure, or is there room for cooling off periods? I mean, is there any kind of answer to this?
I think with the dynamic pricing example, some of what we've been calling for at Consumer NZ around Air New Zealand's pricing, which is dynamic, based on what we don't know. What we've been calling for is more transparency as to how the algorithm works, because people just don't know whether there are genuinely fewer than 5 seats left on the plane, or whether there are other things that are being used to calculate the price that you as a particular shopper are being offered on that particular day. Now, it could be that it's completely genuine how Air New Zealand calculates its price. We're not alleging they're doing anything deceptive. The problem is consumers are lacking trust in how that model works because, there's no explanation of how it works.
Just before we go, there's one more level of data-driven marketing we should mention: biometric marketing. First brought to public awareness by a Tom Cruise movie, Minority Report. The ads were targeted by an eye scan. That's not here yet, but...
facial recognition is something that at Consumer NZ we've been talking about a lot recently. So it's been trialled in 29 foodstuff supermarkets around the country. Westfield Mall has billboards that use facial recognition to clock your age and your gender and to serve up the ad that's on the billboard based on your biometric information. Now,
so you're saying Minority Report, the film Minority Report, where you recognise from your eyeball scan, is basically here already?
Well, yes, it's interesting because you say that because Foodstuffs has released preliminary results from the trial of facial recognition, and it's saying that it's stopped over 130 serious harm and abuse incidents in its stores by using facial recognition technology. And if that's not Minority Report, I don't know what is. So how they're able to say that the intervention that they took to stop an incident that hasn't actually happened in the future happening is a serious abuse incident. I'm not sure how they've made that leap. We need to see the details of the study, but that's exactly what Minority Report did, didn't it? It predicted future crime.
It did predict future crime, but also part of that movie was just serving up ads as you walked along based on scanning.
So that's right, and it's commonplace overseas as well. But of course, overseas, there are tighter regulations around the collection of biometric information, and the Office of the Privacy Commissioner is working on a code actually for biometrics at the moment, and it's making really good progress on that.
So this is just the whole next level of data-driven individual pricing to maximise revenue.
That's right, and this is why the Australians, well, you could be a cynic and say the Albanese government's come out, picked the kind of 5 or 6 most annoying e-commerce practices and gone, we're going to ban those because from a political perspective, it looks good to be taking action on these. But
it does.
Actually, if you go down another couple of layers, there is an avalanche of pervasive digital practices that are distancing the consumer from the ability to exercise genuine choice when they're purchasing items online, or even, as the examples were given around facial recognition, even in store.
And that wraps up this episode of the NBR Podcast. Links to the audio used are in the description. Thanks to content producer Jake Latham and creative director Michael Hickmott. For early access to new episodes, subscribe at nbr.co.nz. I'm Simon Shepherd. We'll catch you then.